The first thing Kong Tao noticed was the smell. It wasn't food. The opposite of food, the distinctive smell of a kitchen that stopped producing anything edible so long ago that even the ghost of the kitchen had vanished. Rancid grease, mold coming from some structural part, rodent activity, the sour aftertaste of a drain that had not been properly cleaned in months. Beneath it all, the cold smell of an unlit fireplace. He was standing in the kitchen. I knew it was a kitchen because there was a large stone fireplace against the back wall with an iron bracket for hanging a pot, and because there was a workbench along the side wall with a cutting surface that had been used for preparing food sometime in the last decade. There was also a butcher's knife on the workbench, a ceramic jug with something dark and hardened inside, and a rat sitting on the edge of the workbench looking at it with the serene confidence of an animal that had not been seriously challenged for its territory in some time. Kong Tao looked at the rat. The rat looked back. He clapped his hands. The rat walked away leisurely. He turned and surveyed the rest of what he had apparently inherited. The main room had 6 tables, of which 3 were functional, 1 was missing a leg and was leaning against the wall, and 2 were in a state that suggested they had been used as firewood at some point and then abandoned midway through the process. There were stools, 4 complete and 2 broken. The floor was packed earth, with accumulated layers of old rushes, spilled food scraps, ash and general debris, which had become more of a sedimentary record of the settlement's decline than a simple floor covering. 2 paper windows faced the street. One was partially intact. The other was just a frame. Through the undamaged window, a gray mid-morning light entered, with the slant of a city that had decided not to bother showing optimism. He entered through a low door into the warehouse. Empty. Not nearly empty. Not poorly stocked. Empty, bare shelves of rough wood, a ceramic jar that, when the lid was lifted, contained at the bottom approximately 2 handfuls of millet that had been there long enough to have developed their own ecosystem. A second jar contained something that had been oil and was now a solidified memory of oil. A third was empty. On the floor was a sack of something that turned out to be sand, which had no culinary use that he could identify. He went back to the kitchen and stood there for a moment. Then a window appeared in front of him. It was not a physical window, but a translucent text panel that occupied a space in his vision that nothing physical occupied, superimposed on the real world with the precise inaccuracy of something that should not exist and yet did. Imperial Tavern System, Start Registered Host Establishment, Yeongdo-dong Food Stop, Makil District, Western Quarter Current Status, Critical Hunger Index, District, 71 out of 100 Establishment Reputation, 2 out of 100 Daily Capacity, 0 Kitchen Not Operating Ingredient Reserve, 0.3 Days Monthly Debt Obligation, 840 Niang Days until Debt Collection, 11 Main Objective, Feeding the People. Reduce Hunger. Build the System. The system rewards efficiency, not quality. Satiation per dollar spent is everything. Warning, the establishment is 11 days away from forced closure due to debt. The panel remained fixed for a moment, then faded into a small indicator at the edge of his vision, a number that read 71 in a faint amber color, which he understood to be the district's hunger index. He stood in the empty kitchen of the worst food establishment in the Makil district, 11 days away from someone coming to collect a debt that, apparently, he had incurred sometime before he was born, and he thought about what the system had just told him. Money for money satisfaction is everything. Not the taste. Not the presentation. Not the reputation based on quality ingredients. Money for money satisfaction. The relationship between a person's feeling of satiation and the cost of achieving that feeling. He returned to the main room and opened the front door. The Makil district in the morning was the very image of a place where things had been in decline for so long that people had stopped noticing that decline. The street was narrow, unpaved, with drainage channels that did their job roughly. The buildings were low and very close together, mostly residential with shops on the ground floor, a fabric repair stall, a small vendor with a tray of items he couldn't immediately identify, a water carrier leaning against a wall. 3 children were playing in the mud near the drainage canal. A woman hung laundry on a rope that connected 2 buildings, moving with the efficiency and economy of someone who has nowhere else to go and no energy to waste on anything superfluous. Across the street, a man sat on a low stool in front of what appeared to be a functioning food stall, modest, but with smoke billowing from its chimney and a pot visible through the open front. He watched Kong Tao with the relaxed attention of someone enjoying a show. "I heard the billboard changed hands again," the man said. How much did you pay for that? Kong Tao looked at him. 2 niang, the man said, answering his own question. I heard it was 2 niang. Choi Dukbei's nephew charged 2 niang for it because no one else wanted it for 1. He shook his head in sincere gratitude. Are you from outside the district? I just arrived, Kong Tao said. That explains everything. The man looked at the storefront, the torn paper window, the door hanging slightly crooked from its top hinge, the faded and barely legible sign above it. Jiang before you couldn't keep it open. The man before Jiang couldn't keep it open. In this district, in this market, with that kitchen. He took a breath through his teeth. What are you planning to cook? Do you see what they're asking for pork? For a decent grain? 3 weeks ago, armed men carrying army bags wiped out all the intermediaries between here and the South Gate. What's left is what the army didn't want. That's what I plan to cook, Kong Tao said. The man stared at him. Kong Tao went back inside. She spent 2 hours in the kitchen. Not remodeling it, but cleaning it. There was a difference, and that difference mattered because cleaning cost labor and remodeling cost money he didn't have. He found a stiff brush behind the kitchen door, a bucket with a crack that still held water if carried carefully, and a water fountain in the building's backyard. She thoroughly cleaned the fireplace, the countertop, the cutting surface, and the floor around the cooking area. He found and removed 3 active rat nests from the gap between the storage shelves and the back wall. He cleaned the drain. He opened all the doors and windows that could be opened and let the gray morning air circulate through the house. After 2 hours, the kitchen was not clean according to any standard that would have satisfied a modern health inspector. It was clean enough to cook with without the food becoming immediately contaminated. That was the relevant standard. Then he went to the market. The Makil district's morning market was all that remained after everything worthwhile had been taken away. Kong Tao examined it with the focused attention of someone cataloging available supplies instead of searching for the ones they want. Pork, not available at any price he can afford. Beef, theoretically available through a single supplier, at a price that would have consumed all of its operating capital for 3 days of minimal use. Good quality grains, good millet and good rice had disappeared. What remained was the broken grain, the cracked grain, the smaller than regulation size, the slightly discolored grain that the army's purchasing agents had discarded because their quotas were only for whole grain. He bought cracked millet. He bought it wholesale, at a price that reflected exactly how little the rest of the world wanted it. Then he went to the slaughterhouse scraps. Every butcher had it, the material left over from the animal after removing everything that could be sold. The bones. The large ones with marrow, the small ones with nothing, the cartilaginous connective tissue that had no culinary prestige but did have collagen. Pig's trotters that nobody had bought. Offal, stomach lining, intestines, liver that was no longer at its peak of freshness. Fat trimmings. The butcher looked at him when he asked for the contents of the trash can. Everything? Asked the butcher. How much? The butcher mentioned a figure that, in fact, represented the cost of his disposal. He was paid to take away something that the butcher would otherwise have to handle. He bought old vegetables from a vendor who was about to turn them into compost, turnips, radishes, onions that had lost their outer layers but retained their interior, dried mushroom stems. He bought a jar of fermented pasta that had long since expired, when any self-respecting cook would use it, and therefore its price was reduced to the cost of its ceramic container. He carried everything back to the kitchen in 3 trips. He lit the fire. The iron stand held the largest pot in the kitchen, a wide, deep container in good condition. She filled it with water. First he placed the bones, those with the most marrow, splitting them with the butcher's knife to expose the inside. Then he added the fat trimmings. He added the fermented paste, the dried mushroom stems, and the onion. He adjusted the heat to a constant level that would gradually extract all the components from the bones without burning them. As the temperature rose, he cleaned and prepared the viscera, the stomach lining, the intestinal section, and the liver. It wasn't a refined preparation, but a functional one. Eliminate what might make people sick. Keep what nourishes them. He added the cracked millet at just the right moment. She added the root vegetables when the base was firm enough to support them. 2 hours later, the kitchen smelled of food for the first time in months. He looked at the pot. Brown in color, opaque, dense from the extracted collagen and fat from the bone marrow, and from the fermented umami of the paste, thick from the broken grains that had absorbed the liquid and swelled into something substantial. On the surface, the melted fat formed a layer that reflected the light. It looked exactly like it did, the cheapest possible combination of materials available in a market stripped of everything valuable, cooked with the aim of extracting maximum nutritional value and satiety from ingredients that everyone else had discarded. It wasn't pretty. The system indicator at the edge of his vision changed. A new panel briefly appeared. First cooking completed, estimated satiety value, high, 340% above base ingredient cost, ingredient efficiency, 89% hunger index impact, distribution pending, achievement unlocked, bone knowledge collagen extraction rate plus 15%. Bone marrow yield plus 20%. It faded away. Kong Teo stared at the pot. 11 days until the debt was due. An empty district outside a broken gate. A rat that would probably return at night. And a very large, very cheap, and surprisingly effective pot of food that the rest of the market had decided wasn't worth taking seriously. He picked up the ladle. It was time to find out who was so hungry as to be mistaken about what was underneath. He made the sign from a broken piece of wood from a shutter. 3 characters, written in charcoal, large enough to be read from across the street, free today. 1 bowl per person. He jammed it into the doorframe with 2 blows of the butcher knife handle and stepped back. Then he waited. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. The street followed its morning routine, the water carrier passed by without looking, the children in the drainage ditch ignored him, the woman with the laundry hanging out glanced at the sign and looked away with the experienced skepticism of someone who has learned to distrust advertisements. The man across the street at the still operating food stall read the sign, looked at Kong Teo, and smiled with the smile of someone watching another person make a professional mistake. 12 minutes later, one of the children opened the door. A 9 or 10-year-old child, with the thinness characteristic of inadequate and prolonged nutrition, rather than from having skipped a single meal. He looked at the sign, then at Kong Teo in the doorway, and asked, "Free?" "Free," Kong Teo replied. "A bowl." The boy looked at the pot that was visible behind him. Then he went inside. Kong Teo filled a bowl and placed it on the least damaged table. The boy sat down, looked at the contents, brown, thick, steaming, with visible pieces of turnip and grain, and said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up the spoon. The second child appeared at the door 30 seconds later. Then a third. By the time the workers arrived, there were 11 people inside and a small group at the door. They arrived in the same way that the workers faced something uncertain, as a group, maintaining social cohesion, so that no individual would suffer the consequences of being seen receiving free food from the worst establishment in the district. 4 of them together, burly, with rough hands, with the typical build of men who earned their living by moving heavy objects. Dock workers, possibly, or warehouse workers from the storage district that's 2 streets away. One of them, a burly man with a scar on his chin, looked at the pot, looked at the children eating, looked at Kong Teo. "What's wrong with it?" he said. "Nothing," Kong Teo said. "It smells like entrails." "It has entrails." "Why is it free?" "Because you won't come back tomorrow unless I prove to you that it's worth coming back." The man with the scar considered this logic. He was sincere enough to be a little disconcerting. He sat down. His 3 companions sat down. Kong Teo filled 4 bowls. The man with the scar ate 3 spoonfuls, then stopped and stared at the bowl as if he'd done something unexpected. "It's thick," he said. "Bone-in brain broth. It takes longer to digest." The man ate the rest without saying a word. When he finished, he sat for a moment with the peculiar stillness of someone taking stock of their inner thoughts and discovering that the result was better than expected. Then he looked at Kong Teo. "How much does it cost tomorrow?" 3 niang. The man made a sound that was neither agreement nor objection, the sound of a man reconsidering a previous assumption. He and his companions left. 2 of them looked back from the doorway. The jeers came with the crowd. By mid-morning, the news had spread through the nearby blocks in the same way that news of free food spreads in a hungry neighborhood, not like an advertisement, but like a current, a change in the flow of people appearing at the door after having been somewhere else 10 minutes earlier. With them came the commentators. The man in front arrived with his arms crossed and the expression of a professional observer. Two women from the fabric repair stand came to look, not to eat. A group of older men, who apparently had no other function than to comment, positioned themselves near the door and began to do so. Look at the color. It looks like the water they use to wash bones. It's probably because it's the water they use to wash bones. Laughter. Kang Tao poured the water with a ladle and said nothing. Hey, innkeeper. What's the name of this dish? Bone broth with grains and vegetables, said Kang Tao. That's not the name of a dish. That's a description of what you swept off the market floor. More laughter. The children who were eating looked up briefly and then went back to focusing on their bowls, with the same attention as people for whom food is more important than the social behavior surrounding it. A woman in her mid-30s, dressed in the practical clothes of a fabric merchant and with the confident posture of someone who had earned her own living for years, entered, looked at the crowd, looked at the pot, and sat down with the decisive gesture of someone who had decided to form her own opinion rather than inherit that of the group. He ate the whole plate. Then he said, without addressing anyone in particular, "That's very generous." The commentators adjusted. They didn't remain silent, they simply adjusted. The mockery continued, but it had lost the certainty it had had 30 seconds before. The crowd, at its peak, perhaps reached 40 people, some eating, others watching, others doing the peculiar dance of wanting to eat but not wanting to be seen, wanting to eat free food from the worst tavern in the Makil district. Kang Tao worked the pot tirelessly, pouring water with a ladle, checking the level and calculating how much was left. The system indicator had been updated, hunger index 71, unchanged. A single meal for 40 people in a district of thousands was not going to make a difference. But the establishment's reputation had gone from 2 to 7, which was still terrible, but better than nothing. She was filling a bowl for a second person, an elderly man who had come alone and was eating with the concentration and efficiency of someone who hadn't eaten well for several days, when she heard the noise coming from the front of the room. A man she didn't recognize was standing near the door, with both hands pressed against his stomach, leaning forward and making sounds. Loud sounds, the theatrical sounds of a distressed person, made at a volume calibrated to be heard. "Poison," the man said. Loudly. "Something's wrong. My stomach hurts." He leaned further, resting his head on one of the side tables. The table moved. Two people near him stepped back. The crowd at the door fell silent, with that particular quality of a crowd that has just been given a reason to become something other than a simple crowd. "He's been poisoned," someone said from outside. "The food." "I said it looked bad." Kang Tao looked at the man. He was about 40 years old, burly, and wore the clothes of someone who worked in the market, but not physically. He was neither a porter nor a loader. His hands, which gripped the edge of the table, had no calluses. Her distress was visible and reflected in her posture, but her face, when she turned partially towards Kang Tao, had the particular quality of a performance that was monitoring her own reaction. And Kang Tao was almost certain that he had appeared at the door 14 minutes ago, without having eaten anything. "Which bowl did you take?" Kang Tao asked aloud. The man groaned. Specifically, Kang Tao said. "Who served you? When?" "You've been here less than 15 minutes, the grain in the pot takes longer than that to cause any reaction." "The broth. Everyone in this room has had the broth. Who else is sick?" He looked around. The old man with the second bowl gave him a fleeting glance. "The children." "The men carrying them, two of whom were still present." "The fabric seller." "No one else claimed to be sick." "This man," Kang Tao said, addressing the crowd now gathered at the door, "arrived after the main service and I didn't see him eat. I'd like to know which bowl he claims caused his symptoms." The man's moans reached their peak and then, apparently because the script required it, began to subside. He straightened up slightly. He took his hands off the table. He left through the door before anyone could ask him any more questions. The crowd outside murmured. So, because the crowds in the starving districts had a highly developed theatrical instinct, they largely arrived at the correct interpretation on their own. The murmurs took on a different character. The Strafa arrived 20 minutes later. Two young men and one older man. The latter was a burly figure whose uniform fit him like it does people who have worn the same one for many years while growing old inside it. He scanned the room with the professional gaze of a man who determines what kind of situation he is in and what value it has. Before the conversation ended, Kong Teo would learn that his name was Choi Dukbae, senior patrol officer of the western sector of Makal district. He had a round face, with that slight permanent blush that results from the combination of soju and authority, and he moved with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to arriving at situations that were resolved in his favor, regardless of the concrete facts. He looked at Kong Teo. He looked at the pot. He looked at the other people in the room. A poisoning has been reported, he said. There was no poisoning, Kong Teo replied. The person who reported it left before they arrived, didn't eat from the pot, and can't be identified as a customer. I'll determine what happened. Of course. These people ate from the same pot. Kong Teo gestured around the room. All of them. None of them are sick. The claim was false. Choi Dukbae looked at the dining area. The old man was still there, finishing what appeared to be a third bowl, seemingly indifferent to the official presence. The men carrying the goods had left, but the cloth seller remained, observing the exchange with the focused attention of someone gathering information. Choi Dukbae approached the pot. He investigated it. He looked at Kong Teo with an expression of institutional consideration, the expression of a man who had not yet decided which of the several available positions he would fill. To operate a food establishment, you need district registration, he said. I know. The registration for this establishment is transferred with the property. I have the documentation. This was true, as Kong Teo was able to verify. The papers he had found in the back room included what appeared to be a district registration certificate in the name of the previous owner, which at least provided a starting point for the conversation. Choi Dukbae examined the certificate. He looked at it for longer than strictly necessary to read it. Registration requires annual renewal, he said. And then there's the issue of monitoring public gatherings. When there are crowds outside. There were no crowds inside beyond normal capacity. There are security considerations. Fire risk. Sanitation. Noise regulations. He folded the certificate and held it instead of handing it back. These things require supervision. Supervision requires resources. Kong Teo looked at the folded certificate the man was holding. How much? He asked tersely. And when? Choi Dukbae mentioned a figure and a date, a monthly payment, the first due in 10 days, 1 day before the collection of the debt on the property, suggesting a coincidence or a degree of coordination that implied that the debt and the supervision were not disconnected systems. The figure wasn't catastrophic. It was designed not to be high enough to be significant, low enough to be affordable, conceived as a permanent cost rather than a closure cost. A tax on the right to operate, levied by the person with the authority to define what operation is legal. What if the payment is delayed? Kong Teo asked. Then the establishment has hygiene problems, Choi Dukbae said politely, which requires its temporary closure until an inspection can be carried out. He placed the registration certificate on the nearest table, smoothed it with his finger, and left, followed by his two junior officers. The room was silent. The old man finished his plate, put down his spoon, and looked at Kong Teo with the expression of someone who had already witnessed that conversation many times from the other side. Welcome to Makal district, he said. Kong Teo looked at the certificate lying on the table. Then, in the pot, still a third full, still hot, still giving off the smell that had attracted 40 people to her door that day. Then, on the system indicator at the edge of his vision, which had silently updated during the conversation, threat recorded, district supervision pressure monthly extraction, 200 Niang current operating margin, negative recommended response, generate revenue faster than extraction. Protect the supply chain. Develop district loyalty as a social shield. He picked up the ladle. He still had food in the pot and hours ahead of him. He would solve the money problem tomorrow. Today he was going to finish what he had started. The morning after the free distribution, 3 people returned. Not 40. 3. This was to be expected. The free bowl had been an advertisement, not a promise, and the difference between "I'll take something for free" and "I'll pay 3 niang for the same thing" was the difference between curiosity and conviction. 3 people had crossed her path. The man with the scar on his chin, who ate quickly and left without saying a word. The fabric merchant, who ate slowly and watched the kitchen through the open door with an attention that was not accidental. And the old man, who had apparently decided that the food was worth 3 niang and that the structural instability of the establishment was not his problem. Kang Tao served the 3, noted the income, 9 niang, and pointed out that his monthly debt obligation was 840 niang and Choi Duck-based tribute was 200 niang and the cost of the ingredients for yesterday's full pot had been 63 niang. The calculations still weren't working. They needed to start working in 9 days. He went back to the market. Sim Bakrai found him at the cracked grain stand, where he was making his second bulk millet purchase in 2 days, which was apparently enough evidence of a pattern for her to approach. She was about 45 years old, with a face weathered by years of dealing with other people's incompetence, and she stood next to him at the grain stall with her arms crossed and said, "You're buying too much at once." He looked at her. "The vendor knows you need it," he said. "So today it's 3 niang per measure. Yesterday it was also 3 niang per measure. Tomorrow it will be 330 because he has seen you return twice and knows you will come back again." He examined the grain with the professional assessment of someone who had spent years dealing with precisely this type of problem. "Buy half now. Send someone else for the other half within 2 hours from the stall on the east side. Another person, another price." Kang Tao looked at her. "You were at the free distribution. I live 2 blocks from here. I've seen 3 people try to run that kitchen in 4 years. He paused. "You lasted longer than the first morning, which already makes you unusual. The cereal purchasing strategy worries me." "Do you track cereal prices in the district?" "I track everything in the district," she said with the absolute certainty of someone stating a fact rather than making a statement. "I kept the books for Merchant Yoon's textile business for 11 years, until his son decided he no longer needed a woman counting his money. I've been locked in my room for 6 months doing nothing, which I find intolerable." Kang Tao bought half the grain he needed, in the quantity she recommended. Then he looked at her. 3 niang a day in 1 meal, he said. "And tell me everything you know about where this district's food supply comes from and where it goes." Sim Bakrai uncrossed her arms. 4 niang. I'm worth 4 niang. Yes. I don't have a margin of 4 niang yet. 3 niang and a meal until the margin exists. Then we renegotiated. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had negotiated with many people and was evaluating the quality of this particular negotiation. "Okay," she said. "But I eat before the customers." Oh Pilsung arrived at the kitchen door on the 3rd day with a sack over his shoulder and the cautious demeanor of a man who had something to offer but wasn't sure how it would be received. He was about 30 years old, thin, and had the sharp gaze of someone who made a living in the markets, not buying and selling in the mercantile sense, but in the sense of a seeker. He knew where things were. He knew which vendors were discreetly moving their stocks, which butchers had more waste than they would admit, which warehouses had goods that had been rejected by army buyers and were now in an awkward position, between being unsellable at a good price and having to be liquidated at any cost. "I've heard you buy bones," he said. "Constantly," Kang Tao replied. "There's a slaughterhouse 2 districts to the east that processes meat for the garrison. The army keeps the primary remains. They are left with the secondary waste, legs, heads, viscera, fat, the structural bones they cannot sell. They're currently rendering some of the fat and discarding the rest." He left the sack on the ground. Inside, 12 large bones, 2 pig's trotters, a bundle of fat scraps. This is what they had today. I can bring more. Constantly. How much? Pilsung mentioned a figure lower than the market price for the waste and explained the reason without being asked. The slaughterhouse wanted to avoid paying for disposal, and a regular customer who came regularly was worth more than a slightly higher price from an occasional one. Kang Tao examined the bones. The marrow, properly extracted, would significantly improve the base of the broth. The remaining fat came from 3 days of cooking. The pig's trotters were collagen. "Bring in everything they give you," he said. "Every day. I'll take everything." Pilsung looked around the kitchen, the clean home, the organized countertop, the absence of the visual chaos he had apparently expected. His assessment changed. "Actually, you're going to use all of it," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's the complete model," Kang Tae-oh stated. The rendering operation began on the fourth day. Sim Bakrai had pointed out, with the sharp precision of a woman who had been making that observation for 2 days while waiting to be hired, that Pilsung's slender figure was not being fully utilized. Kang Tae-oh used some of it as cooking fat and added the rest to the broth pot, which was adequate but inefficient. If properly processed and stored, the fat proved to be a stable culinary resource with a shelf life of 3 weeks. If it was not managed correctly, it was a resource that only lasted 2 days and would spoil, representing a total loss. He demonstrated the preparation process with the authority of someone who had learned it in a home kitchen 30 years ago and had never forgotten it: slow heat, long cooking time, clean container, careful skimming. The result was a ceramic jar of clear, melted fat that sat on the shelf with a stability the raw fat lacked. "How much did we recover?" Kang Tae-oh asked. Sim Bakrai provided the weight, estimated cooking uses, and equivalent cost if purchased directly as cooking fat at market prices. The recovery rate was significant. The system was updated, process unlocked, fat processing cooking fat cost, minus 40% broth richness, plus 12% ingredient waste, minus 8% milestone reached, first week of operation choose an improvement path, a deep bone, extended marrow extraction. Satiety value of the broth plus 25%. Cooking time plus 2 hours. Be cold storage, less deterioration of all stored ingredients. Waste minus 30% in 7 days. See portion science, optimal bowl size for maximum satiety per cost. Revenue efficiency plus 20%. Analyzed all 3 options. Reducing waste was the conservative option, it protected what they already had. Optimizing portions was the revenue generating option, it improved the profit margin for each bowl sold. Bone extraction was the key to the product, it made the food itself significantly more effective at what the system continued to measure: satiety. They opted for deep bone extraction. This advantage in terms of satiety was multiplied. If each dish satisfied people significantly better than the competition, it was a structural advantage that no price adjustment could easily overcome. Revenue generation efficiency could be improved by other means. Making the food truly more substantial than any other option available in that price range was the foundation upon which everything else had to be built. Young Mal soon arrived on the 5th day with a basket of dried chili stems and an opinion about his storage rack. He was 60 years old or nearly so, with the slight permanent squint of someone who had spent decades evaluating the quality of things at first glance, and had come because his nephew was Oh Pilsung and he had told him that there was a kitchen business worth visiting. He looked at him for about 4 minutes and then told Kang Tae-oh that storing vegetables was going to cost him money in a week. She was very specific, the turnips were stacked in a way that retained moisture. 2 radish plants were already showing the first signs of soft rot, which would spread to adjacent vegetables within 3 days if no action was taken. The stems of the dried mushrooms were in an open container where they absorbed the ambient humidity of the kitchen and would lose their potency prematurely. In 20 minutes he rearranged the storage shelf, the turnips separated and raised on a stand he built with 2 broken stool legs, the radishes sorted, with the marginal specimens isolated for immediate use, and the mushrooms in a sealed ceramic container. "Salted," she said. "Dried. You're not using either of them correctly." "Show me," Kang Tae-oh said. She showed him. For 3 days, he established a preservation cycle in the kitchen. The leftover vegetables that were not going to be used in the pot in question were salted and pressed for a 3-day fermentation that produced a condiment with a shelf life long enough to be truly useful. The bones that had already been used for the broth were dried and stored. They could be reused for a secondary broth of lower, but not zero, quality. The mushroom stems were dried further and ground into a powder, which added depth to the base broth without the need for the stems to be present. Nothing came out of the kitchen as waste that could be transformed into something. Baek Chung appeared on the 6th day and stood in the doorway without saying anything until Kang Tae-oh saw him. He was big in the way some men simply are, not aggressively, not flaunting it, simply occupying a significant amount of space with serene stillness. Apparently, he had been a truck driver until a back injury prevented him from continuing to do so, leaving him in the ambiguous position of being physically formidable but economically unemployed. Pilsung had sent it. The explanation was simple: the free distribution had proven that cooking could attract a lot of people. And crowds attracted opportunists. An opportunist who grabbed a bowl and ran or pushed forward, disrupting the service, caused more chaos than the bowl was worth. Someone had to stand at the door and define, just by their presence, how the queue worked. Baek Chung took his place at the gate on the morning of the 7th day, in the queue, which already had 11 paying customers, organized itself without a word being exchanged. Lee Sori wasn't hired. Lee Sori just started showing up. The boy was about 13 years old, with the mental agility of someone who had grown up moving around the neighborhood by instinct rather than by direction. He had been one of the children who participated in the free distribution. He returned on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th days. By the 5th day, he was already performing small tasks without being asked, carrying water, moving a package, appearing just when extra hands were needed, and disappearing before it was necessary to formally acknowledge his presence. On the 7th day, Kang Tae-oh gave her a bowl and said, "I need to know things." Sori ate 3 spoonfuls and said, "What things? Where are grain prices moving? Where the best scraps are found before other buyers get to them? When the garrison's purchasing agents arrive? Who ends up eating in this district? The people who are hungriest and haven't yet knocked on the door." Sori reflected on this. That's a lot. 1 bowl a day in 2 niang. 3 niang. 2 niang, and I won't tell Pilsun that you've been stealing loose items from his delivery bags. Sori looked at him with the expression of someone reassessing their evaluation of the adult population. 2 niang, he said. Good. By the end of the first week, the kitchen already had a structure. Pilsung was in charge of the ingredients. Young Mal soon stored and preserved them. Sim Bakrai counted and controlled every measure that came in and every bowl that went out. Baek Chung controlled the gate. Sori patrolled the district and returned with information. Kang Tae-oh cooked, directed, and analyzed the system's feedback, comparing it to the reality of the kitchen to adjust the decisions that the system could suggest, but that he could not make. The number of daily customers had increased from 3 to 19. Revenues covered the costs of ingredients and processing, and preservation efforts had reduced waste to a fraction of what it had been in the early days. The debt repayment was still 9 days away, and the payment to Choi Dukbae was 1 day later, and the margin between current income and those obligations was so narrow that it was worrying. But it was a margin. It didn't exist a week ago. The system was updated on the night of the 7th day, operational threshold reached, functional kitchen staff nodes, 5 active daily efficiency, 74% waste rate, 18%, continuing to decrease district hunger index, 70 marginal improvement reputation, 19/100 warning, external pressure increasing. The presence of competitors is confirmed. Surveillance has been detected in the supply chain. Recommendation: diversify supply sources. Establish redundant storage systems. Strengthen relationships in the district before the next pressure arrives. Kang Tae-oh read it, took note of the warning, and observed the kitchen, clean, organized, functioning with the specific efficiency of a system that had been designed rather than accumulated. Someone had noticed. In the Makal district, being noticed was either the beginning of growth or the beginning of another kind of trouble. Usually both at the same time. Sori brought the news on the morning of the 9th day with the particular energy of someone who carries information she knows is important. The warehouse located at the northern end of Makal, a large facility that handled goods moving between the river docks and the city's inland distribution network, had suspended operations for 3 days due to a licensing dispute with the district administration. 240 porters, loaders, and stevedores had turned up for their morning shift, had been turned away, and now found themselves scattered throughout the district without work, with reduced incomes, and in the particular mood of men who had been promised something and then had it taken away. They're already arguing outside Merchant Yoon's grain stall, Sori said. He raised the prices this morning. He always does that when there's a problem. Kang Tae-oh glanced towards the kitchen. The morning's preparations were complete, 2 large pots on the fire, the base broth from the previous night's bone cutting already at the right temperature, the cracked millet measured and ready, and the preserved vegetables arranged on the work table. He had prepared 40 rations, double his current daily average, and felt optimistic when he made the decision last night. 240 men. He looked at the pots. Then, on the storage shelf, the rendered fat, young Malsoon's pickled vegetables, the dried mushroom powder, the stockpile of cracked grain that Sim Bakrai had been discreetly accumulating by buying in smaller quantities from various vendors for 3 days, which had been an instruction from Kong Teo after Bakrai's observation about the price of grain and for which he was now extremely grateful. She made a decision. "Hire Pilsung," she said. "Tell him I need all the slaughterhouse contact information today. Not tomorrow. Today, in 2 hours." Suri had already set things in motion. Sim Bakrai arrived at his usual time, examined the modified preparation design, and immediately began recalculating without being asked. "You're expanding the stock," he said. "How thin?" "Thin enough to feed more people. Thick enough to still be a meal." She shook her head slightly. It wasn't a sign of disagreement, but an assessment. "If you overdo it, you lose the advantage of feeling full. People notice the difference. They remember how they felt yesterday and how they feel today. I'm not going to extend the deadline for the shares. I'm increasing the volume by increasing the proportion of cereals and adding the base of preserved vegetables to give it consistency. The bone extraction value is kept constant, it is entered into each batch in the same way." Bakrai examined the proportions he had established. She remained silent for a moment, doing mental calculations with the efficiency of someone for whom arithmetic was not a process but a reflex. "You'll need at least 3 batches," he said. "The first pot won't last past mid-morning if the news spreads quickly. Start the second pot in stages, begin now so it's ready when the first one is almost finished. Start the third pot when the second one is halfway through." "Time for the ladle?" he asked. "Slower than yesterday. Controlled pouring, fill to the line, without overfilling. All bowls the same size. If people see variation, they will observe it and congregate near whoever is getting more." This was the kind of knowledge acquired after years of observing the distribution of resources under conditions of scarcity. Kong Teo listened and followed the instructions without modification. Pilsung returned mid-morning with 2 sacks and a different expression than usual. "The slaughterhouse gave me everything it had," he said. "More than usual. But I heard something on the way." He set the sacks on the ground. Apparently, they have already informed him about the situation at today's warehouse in Merchant Park, the one on the main avenue with 3 food stalls. He won't open his stalls until this afternoon. He's waiting for the situation to worsen and prices to rise. He's withholding supplies until the hunger reaches its peak, Kong Teo said. He does it in every crisis. Every time there are a lot of people out of work, he waits for them to get desperate and then opens with 30% more sales than normal. Pilsung paused. "The owners of your stall were laughing this morning. I heard them talking about your place. You said you'd run out before noon and that desperate men would come looking for them anyway." Kong Teo looked at the 2 sacks of bones, fat, and entrails. "Good," he said. "Let them wait." The truckers began to arrive before the second hour. Not all at once, but in irregular groups of men who moved around without a fixed schedule, following word of mouth with the semi-skeptical curiosity of those who had heard something but were not yet convinced to believe it. The first group consisted of 8 men who had apparently received information directly from someone at the free distribution point. They entered, observed the place, looked at the bowls, looked at Baek Chung in the doorway, and immediately understood, from his posture, that the queue had a structure. They joined it. By mid-morning, the queue stretched from the door to the facade of the building. Kong Teo worked tirelessly at home. The rhythm of the ladle was constant, the filling of the bowl uniform, without variations, without hesitation. Bakrai moved along the service line with the focused efficiency of someone conducting a live audit, watching the levels in the bowls, adjusting the ladle guide in fractions, and redirecting Kong Teo's attention to the second pot when the first one reached its minimum level. The second container reached serving temperature at the exact moment the first one became critical. There was no time lapse. The men who had been watching the level of the first boat with the anxious attention of those who had previously been taken away from something, saw how the transition occurred without pause and how the specific tension in the tail posture visibly relaxed. A man near the front said something to the man behind him. The latter spoke back. Kong Teo didn't hear the words, but he caught the tone. "It remains." Young Malsoon appeared at the kitchen door at just the right moment. Kang Tae-oh hadn't summoned her, she had simply arrived because she had been observing the situation from 2 streets away with the instinct of someone who had spent decades sensing when a kitchen needed additional help. She took it upon herself to add the canned vegetables to the 3rd pot without receiving instructions, measuring with the precision of someone for whom portions are a professional matter. The man opposite, the same one who had witnessed the opening day with professional skepticism, arrived at noon. He stayed at the end of the queue, which still had 20 people, and waited his turn. Upon reaching the front, he took his bowl, sat at one of the functional tables, and ate in silence. When he finished, he sat for a moment. Then he asked Kang Tae-oh, "How many have you served?" "About 160. The man took note. His own stall, across the street, serves between 30 and 40 people on a good day. "And you keep running." "3rd pot. One more batch after this one." She glanced toward the stove. In the organized workflow, Bakrai supervising at the counter, Malsoon at the preparation station, Baekchung handling the door with the same serene authority he had when opening it. In the queue, where there had been no pushing or complaining, the man said, "You planned this." 2 days ago, Kang Tae-oh replied. The man left without another word. But he left with the air of someone who had significantly changed his mind. By the end of the afternoon, 211 men had already eaten. Not all of them were dock workers. The news had spread as it did in dense urban districts, and among the crowd were residents, a group of 8 shopkeepers from the lower district who had arrived in the mid-afternoon with the usual official ambiguity of people who could eat as customers or carry out inspections as officials depending on how they were received, street vendors who had closed early, women from the residential blocks who had heard about the matter and had come in the calm of the afternoon. The system was updated, major feeding event, district disruption response portions served, 211 hunger index, district, 67 out of 70 establishment reputation, 41 100ths out of 19 district loyalty, started milestone, first mass feeding choose an improvement, at Q psychology, efficiency and crowd management. Service speed plus 30% under high volume conditions. B reserve trigger, hidden ingredient cache. 3-day emergency reserve, invisible to standard inventory inspection. C loyalty block, the first 50 regular customers are identified. Their loyalty rate increases. Word of mouth multiplies. They choose the booking mechanism without hesitation. The most dangerous vulnerability in the current operation was the disruption of supply. If a competitor, a hostile official or a market crisis disrupted access to ingredients for 2 days, the kitchen would grind to a halt. A secret 3-day reservation was his insurance against the attack he knew was coming. Park Gwi-nam arrived just as the last customers were leaving. Kang Tae-oh already knew who she was before Sori appeared by his side and confirmed it. The man had the bearing of someone accustomed to entering rooms as the most important person in them. He was not physically imposing, he did not speak loudly, but he possessed the specific gravity of a person whose presence represented a category of importance of which the others in the room were constantly aware. He was about 50 years old, dressed elegantly, with the practicality of a man who invested in quality without ostentation, and was accompanied by a younger man, who stood slightly behind and to the right, with the refined posture of someone whose job was to observe and remember. He looked around the kitchen. The empty pots. The footprints left on the floor near the door by 200 pairs of feet. The stack of bowls, which had been full this morning, was now just a small pile. Then he looked at Kang Tae-oh. "You served the warehouse workers today," he said. It wasn't a question. Among others, Kang Tae-oh said, "My stalls on the main avenue were scheduled to open this afternoon." He said it without much emotion. By the time they opened, the workers had already eaten. And they remembered where they had eaten. A brief pause. Where did his bones come from? From various sources. I've been told from the garrison slaughterhouse. That supply is being made through a purchasing agreement that I've been involved in organizing for the past 3 years. He looked at the pot and then at Kang Tae-oh. It would be a shame if that agreement got complicated. The companion was writing something. Kang Tae-oh noticed. "Thank you for the information," Kang Tae-oh said. Park Gwi-nam looked at him with the expression of a man who was readjusting his strategy in real time. He had probably come expecting a small operation led by someone who would respond to the implied threat with defiance or anxiety. Instead, what I saw was a person who had served 200 people in a single day in a kitchen that had been out of service for 2 weeks and who received the information about the interruption of the supply with a serenity that suggested that she had already considered that possibility. "You're not what I expected," Park Gwinam said. "What did you expect?" "Someone lucky and with a pot." He straightened up slightly. "I'm involved in district-level food distribution. I manage distribution relationships with 6 establishments on the main road. I have agreements with 3 grain suppliers and 2 of the largest butcher shops in the city." He let the idea sink in for a moment. "It's worth discussing how a kitchen in this location could be integrated into a larger structure. It would be mutually beneficial." "I'm open to discussion," Kong Teo said. "Good." Park Gwinam headed toward the door. He stopped at the threshold. "The warehouse dispute will be resolved in 2 days. The workers will return to their shifts. The need that her kitchen fulfilled will now disappear. She's gone." Kong Teo stood in the empty kitchen, with the dim light of the sunset coming in through the repaired paper window. He had fixed it on the 3rd day and thought about what he had just received. Park Gwinam controlled the district's food supply structure. He had just told Kong Teo that the emergency that had made today's events possible was temporary. He had offered to discuss how to integrate into a larger structure. And he had made sure that Kong Teo understood that the bone supply had an advantage. All 3 things conveyed the same message: you have something I wasn't expecting, and I'm deciding whether to absorb it or eliminate it. Sori appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had been somewhere for the past 40 minutes and had the appearance of someone who had been listening intently to things that were not directed at him. "Park Gwinam's companion," Kong Teo said. "Who is he?" "His logistics manager. He controls the movement of supplies, prices, and volume." Sori paused. He was counting the bowls from the doorway. From the moment they arrived. So the escort had been overseeing the operation while Park Gwinam spoke. "Establishing real figures, not estimates." 211 portions, Kong Teo said. "Tell me precisely. I want you to say the actual amount." Sori looked at him. "Why?" "Because Park Gwinam came here hoping for a lucky pot. It's becoming clear that it was a system." Kong Teo looked at the pots, empty, clean, already prepared for tomorrow's soaking. "The question isn't whether it turns against us. The question is whether it will act before we are ready or after. And I want you to think about 211 portions while you decide." The warehouse reopened as planned, just as Park Gwinam had said it would. The 240 delivery men returned to their shifts. The disruption dissolved and was integrated back into the neighborhood's daily routine, and according to any reasonable business logic, the emergency that had given Kong Teo the opportunity to feed on a large scale should have disappeared with it, reducing the inflated number of customers to the modest daily average of a small kitchen in a poor neighborhood. This did not happen. On the day the warehouse reopened, 31 truck drivers arrived at the kitchen before their morning shift. Not because they didn't have other options. The warehouse cafeteria was working, street vendors were working, and the stalls on Park Gwinam's main avenue were open. They came because they had eaten here during the service interruption, and the specific memory of satiety was a physical reference point against which other options were now compared. Sim Bakrai tallied the morning count with the satisfied precision of someone whose predictions had been validated. "Habit formation," she said. "The first meal sparks curiosity. The second creates comparison. The third creates habit." "How many times did most of them eat here during the interruption?" Kong Teo asked. "Those who came today?" "Most came twice. Some, 3 times. He looked at his tally sheet. "Those who came only once haven't returned yet. We have to give them another surprise." The street changed in the second week. Not drastically. It's not about the visible transformation of a district that suddenly becomes prosperous. The change was more subtle and lasting. It was about the specific behavior of people who knew there was a reliable food outlet within walking distance. The water carrier, who used to take his midday break closer to the main street, now stopped in front of the kitchen. The women from the fabric repair stand arrived during the mid-morning break between their busiest times. 3 of the lower district's Strazniki not Choi Dukbay's men, but the younger patrol officers from the eastern sector began eating here 4 days a week with the spontaneous regularity of those who have found a solution to an everyday problem. A woman placed a small tray of vegetables outside the kitchen entrance. He sold secondary products, those that were slightly damaged, those that were almost at the end of the shelves and that the vendors in the main market discounted. Their positioning strategy was deliberate. People entering and leaving the kitchen were motivated by food, and people motivated by food bought vegetables. Within 4 days he had a stable business. A man selling cheap ceramic mugs set up shop on the other side of the entrance. So, a tool sharpener who used to work on the main avenue began to locate his business at the end of the block where the kitchen was located, because the pedestrian traffic there was more constant than the calm that was recorded mid-morning on the main avenue. Kong Teo watched everything from the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything to anyone. But he did write the dates in the margin of Bakrai's tally sheet. The kitchen hadn't yet become the district's food distribution center. It was becoming the district's landmark. The place that anchored the movement. That was the precondition for everything that followed. The first selective pressure was exerted through Pilsung's contact at the slaughterhouse. Pilsung arrived on the 17th day with the 2 sacks and a different expression, the characteristic impassivity of a man who controls his anger. They reduced the amount, he said. Half the usual amount. And the price went up. Kong Teo looked at the sacks. Half the usual volume of bones and offal. What's the reason? New agreement with a regular buyer who has priority over secondary waste. Established yesterday. Pilsung dropped the sacks harder than necessary. The buyer is a purchasing agent I don't recognize. No one at the slaughterhouse would say who he represented, but the deal came about suddenly, the day after Park Gwi-nam's logistics manager was seen in the processing area. Kong Teo had expected it. It's not about the exact mechanism, but rather the type of maneuver. Supply pressure was the obvious lever for a man who controlled distribution relationships. He didn't need to confront the kitchen directly. He just needed to make the flow of ingredients more difficult, more expensive, or less consistent. The butcher of the Oriental market, said Kong Teo. The one Bakrai flagged last week for having irregular stock levels. It generates more waste than it admits because it processes for 3 restaurants that only accept prime cuts. Go see it today. Don't mention the slaughterhouse. Just ask him about his problem with secondary waste disposal. Pilsung understood immediately. He'll sell to us to avoid disposal costs. At a lower price than we were paying before, because we're solving his problem instead of creating competition for supply. Kong Teo looked at the reduced sacks. And find 2 more. Not 1. 2 independent sources, neither of them knowing the other. I want the supply to come from at least 4 directions by the end of the week. Pilsung left at his characteristic pace, the pace of a man for whom finding things was a form of self-expression. The rumors started on the 19th. Suri told it in 2 parts, because that's how rumors spread. The first part said that people in the market district were saying that they used spoiled meat in the kitchen. The second piece, which arrived 4 hours later, was more specific. It indicated that the portions of intestine in the product came from animals that had died of disease and not from slaughter, which was the kind of specific detail that anonymous rumors included when they had been constructed rather than arising organically. The timing was not subtle. The rumor emerged 2 days after the pressure on the offer began, which meant that its purpose was to strengthen it rather than initiate it, weaken the offer, then weaken the reputation, apply both levers simultaneously and see which one would cause the deal to fail first. Kong Teo thought about it for an hour. Then he sent Suri to find the 3 Strazniki who ate there regularly and ask them, as a favor to a kitchen that had fed them more than 40 times in 2 weeks, to be present tomorrow morning at the opening. He sent Bakrai to the fabric merchant, the same one who had been one of the first 3 paying customers and who, thanks to the discreet authority of a businesswoman with a good street reputation, had become one of the most credible informal advocates of the cuisine with a specific request. He sent young Malsoon to prepare the kitchen for a full demonstration. The demonstration took place the following morning, before service began. Kong Teo opened the kitchen to the 12 people he had gathered, the 3 Strazniki, the fabric merchant, 2 of the regular delivery men, Suri's selection of 4 market area residents known in the district for having outspoken opinions, and the man across the hall who had observed everything from the beginning and whose skepticism had become a form of interested attention. He showed them the procurement documentation that Bak Rai had been keeping since the third day, the purchase records for each ingredient, the names of the suppliers, the quantities, and the prices. He showed them the current stock, opened all the storage containers, and explained what each one contained and where it came from. He showed them the offal, fresh, obtained that same day, and with its origin clearly identifiable. Then, he prepared a stew from scratch in front of them. It's not a performance, but a step-by-step demonstration of the process, with explanation. How the bones were initially positioned. Why was the temperature kept at a constant medium level instead of a full boil? What effect did the melting of the fat have on the base? Why was the grain added at the specific stage? The fabric seller asked 3 questions. The Strazniki asked 2. The regular delivery drivers watched with the focused attention of those who were comparing what they saw with what they had been told. In the end, he served the demonstration cauldron to those present. He didn't say anything directly about the rumor. He didn't mention Park Gwi-nam by name. He didn't accuse anyone of anything. He simply made the cooking process completely visible to people, who would then talk about what they had seen. In the afternoon, Suri reported that the alternative version was spreading through the district faster than the original rumor. Not because Kang Tae-oh had refuted the claim, but because the people who had been in the kitchen that morning described what they had seen in their own words, with the specific credibility of first-hand testimonies, and first-hand testimonies from a clean and visible process were structurally stronger than anonymous claims. The system was updated, threat neutralized, reputation attack district trust, plus 18% establishment reputation, 58/100ths method, transparency as a counterattack note. The source of the attack has not been publicly confirmed. The competitor's position weakened without direct confrontation. The physical pressure came on the 22nd. 2 men appeared at closing time. They were neither customers nor street vendors. They stood near the entrance, with the patient posture of those who had been instructed to convey a message through their presence, rather than with words. They were big, the kind men hired for their size usually have. Baek Chung stood in the doorway. He looked at them. They looked at him. A professional assessment conducted between 3 burly men, carried out in the same manner as these assessments, quickly, accurately, and with a shared understanding of the relative quantities involved. The 2 men left. They returned the following night. Baek Chung was at the door again. This time, Kang Tae-oh was visible at the kitchen door, and the 3 Strazniki who usually ate there were finishing their dinner at the table closest to the entrance, which was not a coincidence because Sori had told them the night before that the kitchen would appreciate it if they ate dinner at their usual time. The 2 men remained outside for 10 minutes. Then they left. They did not return. What Park Gwi-nam had not calculated, and what Kang Tae-oh understood throughout the days of these small confrontations, was the specific quality of loyalty that the kitchen had unintentionally built. It wasn't gratitude. Gratitude was fragile and conditional, the loyalty of those who felt obligated. What the transporters, delivery drivers, vendors, and residents of the district had developed was something more structural, the loyalty of people whose daily lives had improved in a specific and quantifiable way, who associated that improvement with a particular place, and who therefore had a personal interest in that place continuing to operate. A man who had received food when he was unemployed was grateful. A man was invested who ate here every morning before his shift and whose ability to work depended directly on the quality of that food. The difference between being grateful and being involved lay in the difference between a customer who felt appreciation for an establishment and a person who would tell 2 men at the door that they should think carefully before making a decision. This is what Park Gwi-nam's men found at the gate, not Baek Chung, although Baek Chung was a real physical deterrent. They had come across the accumulated presence of 200 people who had eaten there and who would notice if something happened. Suri expressed it more directly on the night of the 23rd, after the second withdrawal. People in the district talk about the kitchen as if it were their own, he said. It's not like it's yours. It's like it belongs to them. Kang Tae-oh looked at him. Is that a problem? Sori thought about it. No. But it means that if something bad happens to it, they'll be angry. And the poor, angry people of a starving neighborhood represent a specific kind of danger that the rich don't like to approach. Kang Tae-oh filed this observation away in the same place where he filed all of Sori's observations, the category of information that was more strategically valuable than it first appeared. Park Gwi-nam returned on the 25th. this time without his logistics companion. He arrived in the morning, ordered a bowl at the counter like a regular customer, sat at the table closest to the window and ate it all before saying a word. When he finished, he looked at the bowl for a moment. Then at Kong Tae-oh. "The rumor was clumsy," he said. "It was my logistics manager's idea. I should have been more patient." This admission was not an apology. It was a recalibration, the acknowledgement of a professional who had tried a strategy, seen it fail, and was adjusting his model. "Supply pressure will continue," he added. "I want you to understand this clearly. Your access to the slaughterhouse is limited. And it will remain so." "Now I have 4 sources," Kong Tae-oh said. "I had one 3 weeks ago. Park Gwi-nam processed this. How many do you think you can keep?" "As many as I need." A silence. Outside, the morning queue was forming, not the emergency volume caused by the disruption of service at the warehouse, but a steady queue of 15 people at opening time, which would increase to 35 by mid-morning. "The conversation I mentioned when I arrived," Park Gwi-nam said, "is still available." "I know," Kong Tae-oh said. "You're not interested." "I'm interested in what's good for the kitchen. I'm still not convinced that what's good for your body is the same thing." Park Gwi-nam stood up. He adjusted his jacket with the precise gesture of someone regaining their composure after a conversation that didn't go as planned. "The district likes you," he said. "That's a temporary situation. The districts are hungry. Hungry districts are unstable. When the next pressure comes, and there's always a next pressure, we'll see if the district's affection is more enduring than its hunger." He left. Kong Tae-oh looked at the bowl he had left on the table, clean, completely empty. Despite all his influence, his supply chain and his control of the district, Park Gwi-nam had taken advantage of everything. The system was silently updated, antagonist engagement, round 2 completed, reputation attacks, neutralized physical intimidation, withdrawn supply pressure, ongoing active mitigation. Park Gwi-nam status, recalibrating strategy, district loyalty index, 34% rising. The next pressure will be structural, not tactical. Prepare accordingly. Kong Tae-oh read it and returned home. The second pot needed attention. 35 people would be hungry in an hour. The district, which was becoming dependent on that kitchen, needed it to be there when they arrived. That was the response to Park Gwi-nam's threat. Not a counteroffensive. It wasn't a confrontation. It was simply that the kitchen was open, the pot was full, and the district knew it could count on both. Every morning. The first spy arrived on the 28th dressed as a customer. Kong Tae-oh noticed him by his hands. Everyone who regularly ate in the kitchen had workers' hands, calloused, stained, marked by their specific labor. The dock workers had rope burns and bruised knuckles. The women at the cloth stall had needle marks and traces of dye. The Strazniki had calluses from gripping the sword on their right hand and nothing on their left. This man's hands were soft, like those of someone who worked in an office with paperwork or accounting, and he was sitting at the table closest to the kitchen door with a bowl, eating slowly, too slowly, at the pace of someone who stretches out time instead of enjoying the food. He observed the workings of the kitchen with the same concentration with which someone memorizes a sequence. Kong Tae-oh watched him for 20 minutes without changing anything in the operation of the kitchen. Then he went to the storage room, rearranged 3 things that were visible from the door, and returned to the fireplace. The man stayed there for another 30 minutes. He watched as Bakrai measured the portions. He watched as young Mal soon added the base of preserved vegetables. He watched as the proportion of grains was added. He left at the end of the morning service, after apparently witnessing a complete operational cycle. What I hadn't seen, the reservoir of melted fat in the double-bottomed ceramic container located behind the grain rack. The dried mushroom powder that was added to the broth during the preheating stage, before the visible cooking process began. The prior soaking of the bones, which was done overnight, was the real basis of the satiety value of the meat. The specific supplier turnover meant that the ingredients themselves had different characteristics than those that competitors could acquire in the same market. I had witnessed a reenactment of the trial. The trial was real. It was also incomplete in every important respect. Suri, who had been observing the observer on his own, reported that the man headed directly to Park Gwi-nam's main establishment on the avenue after leaving. Kang Tae-oh told Bok Rai to write down the date and description. He'll send a copy to one of the kitchens down the street, Bok Rai said. They'll try the recipe. Let them. They won't have the overnight bone soak. They won't have the fat base. They won't have Malsoon's concentrated preserved vegetables. They'll produce something that looks similar, but it won't nourish people properly. The district will notice the difference within a week. The spoiled meat arrived on the 31st. Pilsung found it, a piece of clearly decomposed entrails that had been placed inside one of the incoming delivery sacks, near the back, wrapped in a clean cloth that had delayed its detection until the sack was already inside the kitchen. He took it to Kang Tae-oh with his jaw clenched and the controlled expression of a man carefully managing his anger. Inside the sack, he said. Wrapped up. It didn't fall inside. Kang Tae-oh looked at the entrails. Then at the sack. The wrapping with a clean cloth was intentional. Someone who knew that a loose piece of spoiled meat could be noticed immediately had taken the time to conceal it in a way that would delay its discovery until it was inside the food preparation area. If Pilsung had been less attentive, if the day had been busier, if the morning preparation had been quicker, he might have fallen into the pot or contaminated the work table. He asked Pilsung to identify which delivery point the sack came from and which part of the handling chain was the most likely insertion point. It was the butcher from the secondary market, the one they had added as a supplier specifically to reduce dependence on the connection with the slaughterhouse. Someone had accessed information about their delivery preparations. Kang Tae-oh sent Sori to the butcher, not with an accusation, but with a question. Had anyone recently contacted the butcher to ask about his relationships with the delivery drivers? Had someone offered money in exchange for information about the kitchen's supply agreements? Sori returned with the answer in 2 hours. 3 days earlier, a man had shown up at the butcher shop, identifying himself as a competitor's supplier trying to understand market prices. I had been in the preparation area for approximately 20 minutes under the pretext of examining the quality of the product. Does the butcher know what was in the sack? Kang Tae-oh asked. No. He thinks it was a normal delivery. Good. Don't tell him. He thought for a moment. Tell him we'd like to expand the relationship, higher volume, regular hours, a slightly better price. And that we prefer deliveries to arrive via Pilsung directly from the preparation area, rather than through the standard loading dock. Eliminate the unattended, non-confrontational access point. The butcher got better terms. Pilsung got direct supervision. The insertion vector was closed. The updated system, threat neutralized, supply contamination method, restructuring of the source relationship vulnerability, closed cost, plus 12 Niang monthly better butcher conditions. The attempted arson of the warehouse occurred on the 34th day, which was faster than Kang Tae-oh had expected. On the 29th, he had established the fake storage location, a small room in a building 2 blocks away, visible to anyone carrying out surveillance on the kitchen logistics, where Pilsung occasionally delivered sacks with the routine of a man carrying out his operations normally. The room contained sacks of standard cracked millet at market price, 2 ceramic jars of common cooking fat, and a small amount of dehydrated vegetables. Everything it contained was replaceable during the morning trading session. Nothing it contained was the actual reserve. The Royal Reserve, the hidden 3-day supply enabled by the system upgrade, was distributed across 3 locations, none of them connected to the visible operations of the kitchen, and none known to anyone except Kang Tae-oh, Bok Rai, and young Malsoon. The fake warehouse caught fire on the night of the 34th. A small fire was brought under control by the night watchman before it spread to the adjacent buildings. Sori was in the area because Kang Tae-oh had told her to be there after Pilsung reported seeing an unknown man watching the delivery route twice in 3 days. He observed 2 figures leaving the vicinity of the building shortly before the fire was discovered and described them with the ability to recall details typical of someone who had been trained to do so. In the morning, Kang Tae-oh opened the kitchen at the usual time. The morning customers arrived. The pot was full. Service went smoothly. The kitchen's operation was no different from any other morning. By midday, the news had spread throughout the district. Someone had set fire to a warehouse near the kitchen. By mid-afternoon, the additional detail was confirmed. The kitchen was still open. It had opened on time. It was still serving. Whatever the purpose of the fire, it had not achieved it. The district's interpretation of this sequence was instinctive and accurate. Someone had tried to damage the kitchen and had failed. The kitchen was more resistant than it appeared. From a customer loyalty standpoint, this was significantly more valuable than a kitchen that had never been attacked. Suri reported that 3 people who were not regular customers entered for the first time that afternoon. When he asked one of them why, the man said, "I heard someone tried to burn it. I thought I'd come and see what all the fuss was about." The attempt to recruit workers was the most sophisticated operation and the most revealing failure. On the 37th, a well-dressed woman approached the kitchen during the mid-morning service, not to eat, but to talk to Bak Rai. She identified herself as the manager of a larger establishment on the main street and offered Bak Rai a position with double her current salary. Bak Rai went to find Kong Teo immediately after the conversation, which revealed everything she needed to know about the outcome. She reported on the offer with the accuracy and objectivity of someone filing an incident report, rather than considering a personal decision. "What did you tell him?" Kong Teo asked. "That I would consider it," Bak Rai replied. "Because I wanted to know if he would say anything useful while thinking I was interested." And he was. The woman had mentioned, when explaining the advantages of the position, that the kitchen currently used an accounting method that generated inefficiencies that a more experienced operation could correct. The level of specific knowledge that emerges from this comment regarding the kitchen's internal accounting practices confirmed that the observer on the 28th day had reported in detail. They knew the visible workflow. They knew the portion measurement system. They knew Bak Rai's role. They were unaware of the royal reserve, the night soaking, or the preservation chain. None of these elements had been visible to the observer. The same woman returned 2 days later to speak with Pilsung. He approached Kong Teo with the offer, more than double, plus a sourcing commission. Kong Teo looked at him. "He's not actually offering you a job," Kong Teo said. "He's offering you money to stop looking for suppliers for this kitchen. The position is just a pretext." Pilsung pondered this. "How do you know?" "Because what he needs isn't your skills. He needs to shut down the supply network we've built. You're more valuable to her when you're not in this kitchen than when you're present in her operation." He looked directly at Pilsung. "I can't match the offer in money. Not yet. What I can tell you is that in 6 months this kitchen will generate enough profit margin to make the offer irrelevant, and that the network of suppliers you have created here is yours. The relationships are in your name, the contacts know you and will follow you wherever you go. Working for a public institution on a fixed salary makes you an employee. What you've built here makes you a partner in a supply chain." Pilsung was silent for a moment. Then he said, "He offered me more money than I've seen in a year." "I know." Another silence. "The slaughterhouse contact," Pilsung finally said. "When Park Gwinam pressured them, they cut off our supply. But they came back when we no longer needed them urgently. I was the one they called when they wanted to rekindle the relationship." He paused. "Because the relationship was with me." "Yes." Pilsung stood up. "I'll tell them I'm unavailable." The system was updated on the night of the 38th milestone. Network integrity maintained under active recruitment. Staff loyalty high across all nodes. Attempted attack vectors 5 surveillance, supply contamination, storage destruction, staff recruitment. X2 successful attack vectors 0 choose an upgrade path. Night logistics out of hours supply and delivery network. Procurement of supplies outside of peak competition periods. Supply cost -25%. B district anchor. Formal relationships with 10 households in the district. Mutual support network. Physical protection of the community during crises. C. Hidden depth, secondary cooking capability, not visible to external observation. Plus 80% boost capability without external signal. He looked at the 3 options for longer than he had looked at any other previous option. Nighttime logistics reduced costs and distanced the kitchen from competition for ingredients, something valuable in an increasingly tight supply environment, which, according to the file of everything Sori reported, was the direction the district was heading. The district coordinator formalized what loyalty had been organically building, turning goodwill into a structured, mutual relationship that would last under direct pressure. The hidden depth solved the overload problem. The massive feeding event had revealed a real limit to operational capacity, and Park Gwinam had seen that limit. He knew the kitchen's maximum capacity. The hidden capacity meant that any future attack based on a known operational limit would encounter a different reality than expected. He opted for hidden depth. Park Gwi-nam's next move, whatever it was, would be tailored to what he believed the cuisine could offer. When that moment arrived, the kitchen needed to be capable of more than he thought possible. On the 40th day, a man who was neither a customer nor a spy arrived in the kitchen. He was about 35 years old, thin, and had the weathered look of someone who moved frequently between different districts. He asked for Kong Tae-oh by name, not the tavern owner, nor the cook, but his specific name, and waited with the patient serenity of someone accustomed to waiting for important people. He said he represented a grain merchant who operated in 3 districts and that he had been following the development of the cuisine through business contacts. The merchant had observed that the kitchen maintained consistency in the supply of ingredients despite 2 documented attempts at disruption, served large volumes at low cost without quality deteriorating, and had managed to build customer loyalty in the district, protecting it from the usual pressure tactics that worked with other establishments. As he explained, the trader was interested in a supply relationship. Not a controlling relationship, but a steady one. Volume pricing, priority allocation, direct delivery. In exchange for the kitchen committing to a minimum monthly purchase. Kong Tae-oh looked at him. That wasn't Park Gwi-nam's method. Park Gwi-nam used influence and pressure. This was someone who had seen pressure and leverage fail, and had come to a different conclusion. The kitchen was not a target to control, but a reliable customer to cultivate. Who told you about us? Kong Tae-oh asked. The man smiled slightly. Several people. In 3 different districts. Your name comes up in more conversations than a kitchen this size usually generates. Kong Tae-oh looked at Bak Rai, who was listening from the counter with her tally sheet in her hand and the expression of someone doing arithmetic calculations in a situation with more variables than cereal prices. The cuisine was no longer a local phenomenon that Park Gwi-nam was trying to manage. It was well known enough that a merchant from several districts had sent a representative to his door. The system's amber indicator, located at the edge of his vision, changed color for the first time since its initialization. It went from amber to a pale gold, a color he had not seen before and which carried the specific quality of a threshold having been crossed, rather than a task having been completed. He told the merchant's representative to return in 2 days with the conditions in writing. Then he returned home, because the afternoon pot needed attention and 43 people would arrive within an hour, and whatever the kitchen was at the district level, at the merchant level and at the level of Park Gwi-nam's recalculation strategy, it was still first and foremost what it had always been, the place where the district came to eat. That was the foundation. Everything else was built upon it, and that foundation had to remain firm. The price change occurred in a single week. Not gradually, as happened with real supply disturbances in urban markets, which did not follow the smooth curve of economic theory, but in a series of steps, each discrete and irreversible. On Monday, the grain cost 3 niang per measure. On Wednesday, it cost 4.5. On Friday, the seller who had been selling at 4.5 had no stock and the only grain available was at 7 niang from a secondary trader who had clearly been stockpiling for this very moment. Kong Tae-oh watched from the market and didn't make a purchase. The reservation was already made. The nighttime supply network that Pilsung had been quietly building for 2 weeks, the nighttime logistics capacity it had developed after the system upgrade, buying from suppliers who moved stock in the hours before dawn, when competition was minimal and prices reflected actual supply rather than panic, had been working regularly enough to keep the kitchen's 3-week supply full and rotating properly. He didn't buy anything that week. He observed who was buying, at what price, and with what expression. The shops on the main streets began to show signs of pressure on day 46. The first sign wasn't a closure, but a reduction in the menu. The largest food establishment on Mackle's main street, which used to serve 5 dishes a day, reduced its offerings to 3. 2 days later, 2. The quality of the remaining dishes declined in the specific way that happens when a kitchen accustomed to prime cuts of meat tries to substitute them with cheaper secondary cuts without adjusting the technique. The texture was incorrect, the cooking time was incorrect, the seasoning was calibrated for ingredients that were no longer present. Regular customers of those establishments noticed it. In a neighborhood with food shortages, people were very demanding regarding value for money. A bowl that cost 8 niang and felt like 6 niang was a worse result than a bowl that cost 3 niang and felt like 4. Sori presented the public attendance reports with the restrained satisfaction of someone providing information that confirms a previous analysis. The street vendors selling alcoholic beverages are half empty by mid-morning, he said. Those that are open. 2 of Park GWI-nam's establishments have reduced their hours. How many customers have switched to our business? Sori gave him a number. Then he gave her the breakdown by categories: transporters, residents, middle-level workers who had previously considered the cuisine to be of too low status for their custom, and notably, 3 merchants from the business district who had arrived with the wary expressions of people entering an establishment that is not their usual standard and discovering, to their visible surprise, that the food solves their real problem regardless of the social register of the place. Bakrai had noted each new face on her tally sheet with a small mark indicating that it was the first visit. The marks from the first visit that week occupied twice as much space as in any previous week. The man across the hall came into the kitchen on the 48th day and asked to speak privately. His name was Han Myung-soo, and during the 6 weeks that the kitchen was in operation, he completed the journey from professional skeptic to attentive observer, eventually arriving at something Kang Tae-oh had been waiting for without explicitly anticipating it: a competitor who had come to the conclusion that competition was the wrong model. He ran a modest but functional food business. He knew his district well. He understood supply chains perfectly, like someone who had worked in them for years. And he had spent 6 weeks observing a kitchen that operated on different principles than his own and that produced objectively superior results under the conditions existing at that time. He said his business was struggling. Not in crisis, but struggling. Ingredient prices were impacting his profit margin in a way his business model wasn't designed to absorb. For 3 years it had relied on the same top-quality suppliers, but now those suppliers were either unavailable, too expensive, or redirecting stock to army purchasing agents, who paid a premium without asking questions. He didn't ask for charity. He asked a specific question: how did the kitchen maintain a regular supply? Kang Tae-oh stared at him for a long time. The instinct to protect the operational advantage was real and present. But for 2 weeks he had been mulling over another question: what would happen to the district's food security if the kitchen was the only food establishment operating in the area? A single point of supply was a single point of failure. If something were to happen to the kitchen, another attempted arson, a successful disruption of the supply, an official shutdown, the district would have nothing. He explained the supply structure to Han Myung-soo. It's not about the locations of the reserves, nor the hidden capacity and depth, but about the framework, the secondary supply of waste, the redundancy of multiple suppliers, the dawn purchases, the fat processing system, the vegetable preservation process. Han Myung-soo listened with the focused attention of a craftsman receiving technical information in his professional field. He asked 4 questions, all of them precise. He didn't take notes, he didn't need to. When he left, Kang Tae-oh watched him cross the street and go back into his own shop. Bakrai appeared beside him. You gave him the method. Part of it. Why? Because if his kitchen survives the price shock by using secondary sourcing, the district will have 2 functional food operations instead of 1. That's better for the district than having a monopoly. He paused. And because a man who learns something useful from us is not the same as a man who competes with us. It becomes part of the logic of the offer. Park GWI-nam's escalation occurred on the 51st day. This time it wasn't through market pressure, but through the administrative channel that Kang Tae-oh had been waiting for since the conversation with Choi Duk-bae on the 2nd day. A formal complaint had been filed with the district administrative office alleging that the kitchen was operating outside its registered category, serving volumes that required a business establishment license rather than a standard food stall registration, and that the current registration was therefore invalid. The complaint was technically debatable. The volume of the kitchen had grown far beyond what a standard food stall registration was designed to cover. Whether that created a genuine legal deficiency or simply an opportunity to generate paperwork depended entirely on who was handling the complaint and what the complainant had told them. Choi Duk-bae arrived on the 52nd day with a document and the expression of a man who was performing a function that had been entrusted to him by someone superior to his usual operational level. Kang Tae-oh had prepared for this conversation with the same method he had used to counter the rumors, not a defense, but a demonstration. He showed Choi Duk-bae the tally records, the daily portions, the revenue figures, the documentation of the origin of the ingredients, the payment history, including, prominently, the complete and timely record of Choi Duk-bae's monthly agreement. He showed her the food safety documentation that Bak Rai had been keeping since the third day, with the meticulousness of someone who had decided that this paper was a form of protection. He showed her the customer records, not the names, but the volumes. The daily traffic. Then he showed her the district hunger index figures that Sori had been informally tracking since day one, the estimated number of households in the immediate district of the kitchen whose food security had noticeably improved, contrasted with the price increase data for the current week. According to the statement, the administrative complaint argued that the volume of the kitchen exceeded its registration category. The kitchen's workload existed because it met a need that no other establishment in the district was fulfilling at the time. Closing it down over a registration technicality during a price crisis would eliminate the main source of functional foods for approximately 240 households whose alternative options had been reduced by 30% in the past week. Choi Duk-bae examined the documentation. He was a man accustomed to operating in the comfortable space between rules and their application, and he immediately understood that what he was seeing was a situation in which rule-based action and practical outcome pointed in radically different directions. He also understood, although it wasn't explicitly stated, that the three Strazniki who ate there daily belonged to his patrol sector. The transporters who supplied the labor force to the warehouse district and whose work capacity was supported by this kitchen were people whose cooperation facilitated their patrol work. The district's current mood, under pressure from rising prices, was so volatile that eliminating a food source wouldn't improve the situation. He folded the document. The registration problem will require a solution, he said. In time. The current inspection finds no immediate grounds for closure. He left. His monthly payment had been made on time. The paperwork was in order. The district's dependence was real and evident. None of this had been by chance. Park Gwi-nam arrived personally on the 53rd day. He did not order food. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched all the morning operations, Bak Rai at the counter, Mel-soon at the preservation station, Pilsung finishing delivering a package, Baek-chung at the door managing a queue that now regularly reached 40 people at peak times. He stared at him for a long time. Then he said to Kang Tae-oh, who was by the fireplace, "My three largest establishments have reduced their service by 40% this week. I can't get raw materials with a margin that allows me to operate at my previous prices. My clientele is migrating." Kang Tae-oh said nothing. "You built it for this," Park Gwi-nam said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the observation of a man who had just grasped the chronology of the decisions he had been observing for 6 weeks. From the beginning. Bones, fat, grain, preservation. It was built for a market where good produce disappears. "The market always goes where the supply goes," said Kang Tae-oh. "The supplies always went to the army." Park Gwi-nam watched the queue forming outside. He observed the steady, rhythmic operation of the kitchen, neither rushed nor heroic, simply continuous. A machine working properly. "The conversation I've been proposing," he said. "What would it take for you to actually have it?" Kang Tae-oh turned the ladle in the pot and looked at the broth, dark, brown, giving off a smell that now meant something specific to several hundred people in the Makil district. The aroma of the food that was about to be served. "You would have to understand that what I have built doesn't work within your structure," he said. "The structure I have is the product. You can't take the product and give it a different structure without destroying what makes it work. So what do you propose?" "I haven't proposed anything yet," Kang Tae-oh said. "You came to see me. That means conditions have changed compared to 3 weeks ago. Come back when you know what you truly need and what you're truly willing to offer, instead of what you assumed would be enough when you thought you could pressure me." Park Gwi-nam stood on the threshold for a moment longer. Then he said, with the tone of a man making a sincere admission rather than a tactical concession, "You're the only kitchen in this district that isn't struggling." "I know," Kang Tae-oh said. "That's going to attract the attention of people above me." "I know that too." Park Gwi-nam left. The updated system, market tip reached competitor establishments with reduced capacity, 7 market share of kitchens in the district, 34% of daily meals, 8% increase impact of price shock on the kitchen, minimal, the reserve and supply structure is maintained district hunger index, 74, increasing despite kitchen operation source of external pressure. Escalation beyond the district level new threat category detected, administrative and supply chain actors, city level recommendation, prepare for contact from actors outside the district authority. Kang Teo read the last line. Above Park GW Inam's level. He himself had said so, standing on the threshold, and the system had simultaneously confirmed it. The kitchen had started out as the worst food establishment in the worst area of the district. 6 weeks later, it was the only food distribution operation in the district functioning at full capacity during a supply crisis, with a reserve that could sustain it against further disruptions, a network of personnel that had withstood all attempts at recruitment and sabotage, and a district loyalty that had turned a social asset into practical protection. Now it was visible, too. Not just to the district, but to the entire city. At the level of administration and trade, they watched over supply structures like hawks watch over fields, waiting for the moment when something that had been small enough to be ignored became large enough to matter. That moment, it seemed, had arrived. Kang Teo attended to the next customer in line, who was one of the dock workers and was eating with the focused efficiency of someone who has a shift to return to, and thought about what would come next. The district had been the first game. He'd played it with bones and melted fat and night supply and a fake warehouse and a boy who listened at the doors. The city was a game in itself. He would have to learn its rules before the players reached his door. The second location came from young Malsoon. She had a cousin, a widow like herself, who managed a small property with a courtyard in the textile district, 2 neighborhoods east of Makal. The property had a working fireplace, a storage room, and was not being used for any commercial purpose at the time. The cousin was not a cook. She was a manager in the same way that Malsoon was a conservator, through decades of practical necessity rather than formal training. Malsoon made the proposal on the 55th day with the frankness of someone who had been considering it for 2 weeks and had decided that the time was right. She can manage a distribution point, Malsoon said. Not a kitchen. We prepare here, she receives, stores, and serves the portions. The textile workers eat at times that don't coincide with ours, early in the morning, before the looms start operating, and late at night, after their shift ends. We don't serve them food. We could be. Kang Teo observed the kitchen's current capacity. The hidden depth improvement had significantly increased its overload capacity, but the overload capacity used for daily volume was not overload capacity held in reserve. Extending service hours to cover work shifts in the textile district from the Makal kitchen was not feasible without disrupting the main operation. A distribution point was different. It's not a second kitchen, but a transfer node. The food was prepared in Makal during the nighttime preparation hours, transported 2 neighborhoods to the east, preserved under suitable conditions by someone who understood preservation, and distributed to a different population according to their own schedule and not that of the kitchen. Will he be able to handle 40 rations in the morning and 40 at night? He asked. 60 each, if the transport is reliable. He told Pilsung to arrange the transport, 2 trips a day, before dawn and after sunset, using the night logistics network that was already operational for supplies. Adding a delivery function to the existing movement pattern generated minimal costs and did not provide greater visibility. The distribution point in the textile district opened on the 58th day. The second home was set up in the enlarged back room of the kitchen on the 60th day. It was not a second kitchen, but a second production line within the same supervised space, which managed the nighttime preparation cycle that supplied both Makal's service and the textile district's distribution. Malsoon managed the night operation with an additional worker she had hired herself, a woman from her residential block who had been doing odd jobs and who proved, in 3 days, to have the specific skills of someone who was naturally accurate with quantities and timings. The nighttime production was packaged in sealed ceramic containers that Bok Rai had obtained through the business contacts of Park Sung-jin, the representative of the grain merchant who had arrived on the 40th day and whose supply relationship had been formalized 2 weeks later. The containers maintained the appropriate temperature during the transport period and retained their quality during the morning service at the distribution point. The system recorded the expansion, network node established, textile district distribution capacity, 120 portions per day, new population reached, textile workers, secondary residence district hunger index coverage, expanded operational complexity, plus 40% warning, increased complexity increases vulnerability to coordination failures. Recommendation: document all processes. Ensure that each node can identify its own problems. Kang Tae-oh asked Bakrai to draft the textile distribution protocols in a separate document, one that would not reference the main kitchen's methods, but would be a complete and self-contained operational guide that Malsoon's cousin could use to identify when something was wrong and what to do about it without needing to contact the main kitchen first. The line of semi-finished products emerged from a conversation with Sori on the 63rd day. Sori had been keeping track of a category of customers that the kitchen never served directly, households that could not come to the kitchen during service hours, but whose culinary situation, single-room dwellings with minimal access to the fireplace, families with sick members, elderly residents who could not transport food, made it difficult to prepare hot meals daily. They bought from the street vendors who had gathered around the kitchen entrance, which was good for the vendors, but it meant they were getting second-rate products at low prices. They want something they can heat up themselves, Sori said. Not a full cooked meal. A base. The concept was simple. Overnight preparation produced a base of concentrated broth, the result of removing the bones before adding the grains and vegetables, that could be sold in sealed portions. A family with access to a fireplace could take the base, add water and whatever grains or vegetables they had, and prepare a hot meal with the added benefit of the satiating effect of the kitchen's bone removal method, without needing to go to a service point. It wasn't food itself. It was the foundation of nutrition. It virtually eliminated the need for skills and equipment to produce nutritionally effective food. Kang Tae-oh commissioned Malsoon to develop the portioning and sealing method. Bakrai set an affordable price for its target household segment, while simultaneously generating a margin above the cost of ingredients. Sori identified 7 street vendors in 3 districts who were willing to sell the product on consignment. They paid for what they sold, returned what they didn't, and kept a small percentage of each sale. Within a week, the concentrated base was moving through 7 distribution points in 3 districts. The system was updated: new product line, distributed base stock reach, 3 districts daily units, 140 to 180 margin per unit, modest but constant strategic value, high, extends the influence of the kitchen without requiring physical presence. Buyers came in 2 categories. The first category arrived at the kitchen door individually, with the caution typical of those who conduct thorough personal research before making an important decision. A textile merchant who had heard about the distribution point through his workers and wanted to understand the supply system. A grain trader, not Park Sung-jin's contact, but another one from the northern business district who had seen the raw products circulating through the network of street vendors, wanted to talk about the production volume. A woman who ran a domestic service for middle-class merchant families wanted to know if the kitchen could supply prepared broths in larger formats for home use. Each of them was looking for something specific. Each of them had come because the product had captured their attention on its own, rather than because of any marketing campaign. Kang Tae-oh conducted every conversation with Bakrai present in his tally sheet on the table, which communicated, without needing to say it explicitly, that everything discussed would be documented. He reached 2 agreements and rejected 1. The cereal distributor's volume offer was structured in such a way that it would have created a dependence on a single supplier for the production of base raw materials, the same vulnerability it had tried to eliminate with regard to the sourcing of ingredients. He politely declined and observed the seller's expression, which confirmed that the refusal had been understood as a strategic response rather than a lack of personal friendship. The second category arrived in a different way. A man named Oh Dae-sung arrived on the 67th day with a letter of introduction from the multi-district grain merchant, whose representative had visited the place on the 40th day. Oh Dae-sung was not a merchant. From what Kang Tae-oh could gather after the first 10 minutes of conversation, he was a logistics consultant, a person whose professional role was to identify effective supply chain structures and advise larger companies on how to replicate them. He said he had been following the development of the kitchen with considerable interest. Not the food itself, but the architecture. The way in which redundancy in the supply of ingredients had been organized. The way in which the distribution network had spread without creating single central points of failure. The way in which the staff structure had withstood sabotage attempts that had been successful against similar operations elsewhere. He said, there are currently 3 food establishments at the municipal level that are dealing with supply chain issues, which the kitchen appears to have resolved. He had been asked to determine if the cooking method could be documented and transferred. Kong Tae-oh looked at him. Transfer it to whom? He asked. Oh Dae-sung mentioned 2 operations. Both were significantly larger than the kitchen. In the current context of supply crisis, both companies were operating at reduced capacity because their infrastructure had been built for a stable supply of quality ingredients that no longer existed in the required volume. They want the method, Kong Tae-oh said. They want the method, the staff structure, and ideally some kind of ongoing advisory relationship. Oh Dae-sung paused. And one of them is linked to a municipal supply office that's currently looking for people who can demonstrate they know how to feed large populations with limited resources. Bakrai took notes without being asked. Kong Tae-oh observed the kitchen, the second oven in operation, the night preparation in its 3rd week of operation, the textile district distribution point serving its morning shift, the network of street vendors moving basic stocks across 3 districts. 68 days later, the most disadvantaged establishment in the Makil district found itself with a logistics consultant sitting at the table asking how to replicate the system. He thought about the system's warning stemming from the expansion milestone: greater complexity increases vulnerability to coordination failures. Each node he had added was a potential point of failure. Each relationship was a potential pressure point for anyone who wanted to exert influence. The kitchen had survived Park Gwi-nam's pressure because it was small enough and well hidden enough that attacking it would cost more than it was worth. A multi-district network was neither small nor uniformly integrated. It was visible. It was understandable to those who understood logistics. And its value, which Oh Dae-sung had just confirmed was visible to actors at the municipal level, justified a considerable effort to control it. He said, tell the operations you mentioned that I'm open to discussing methods. Not a transfer, but a conversation. I'll go to them, not the other way around. And regarding the procurement office contact, I'd like to understand what they actually need before scheduling any meetings. Oh Dae-sung pointed this out with the professional efficiency of someone accustomed to relaying conditional answers between parties. Then he asked a question: how much of what you've built here is documented? Everything, Kong Tae-oh replied. Oh Dae-sung looked at the tally sheet in front of Bakrai. In the conservation records that you can see on the shelf behind the counter. Faced with the systematic and unheroic evidence of an operation that had relied on a documented method rather than individual talent, he commented, that's unusual. It's intentional, Kong Tae-oh said. The documentation is part of the system. If someone in this kitchen were to stop coming tomorrow, their role would continue because it's clearly written for someone else to perform it. Oh Dae-sung was silent for a moment. Then he said, the procurement office will want to meet with you. Not as a supplier. But for something else. I know, Kong Tae-oh said. And he did know. The system's new threat category, administrative and supply chain actors at the municipal level, had been on his mind since day 53. The city's supply office was exactly the type of actor the system had pointed out, not a district-level thug with 2 burly men in leverage in the supply chain, but a structural actor with the authority to define what was legal, what took priority, and what was integrated into the machinery of the city's food management. Being engrossed wasn't the same as winning. But refusing to participate wasn't the same as being safe. He told Oh Dae-sung he would send him an answer within 3 days. After the man left, he sat at the kitchen table with Bakrai across from him and the tally sheet between them and looked at the numbers. 68 days. 2 distribution points. 7 agreements were reached with street vendors. A supply alliance was formalized. Yesterday, 312 servings were served at all points of sale. The system indicator had been gold since the 40th day. It hadn't changed color since. I didn't know what would come after gold. You're going to meet with the procurement office, Bakrai said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And Park Gwi-nam? Kong Tae-oh looked around the kitchen, the stoves, the shelves, the organized flow of a system that had been built to withstand any pressure that a district-level operator could exert. Park Gwi-nam was the district game, he said. The supply office is a completely different game. The only question is whether we play on our terms or theirs. Bakrai looked at the score sheet. So far, we've played every match our way. So far, Kong Tao agreed. He picked up the ladle. The evening service was about to begin. Whatever came from the city would arrive when it was meant to. Until then, the pot had to be tended, and 47 people would arrive hungry in the next hour and leave fed. That was still the basis. It was going to continue to be. Everything else was negotiable. The kitchen wasn't. Yoon Sang-cheol arrived on the 71st day without a letter of introduction. He arrived during the quiet hour between the morning service and the midday preparation, that 40-minute span when the kitchen was engaged in maintenance rather than production. When Bak Rai updated his tally sheets, Mel soon checked the inventory of preserves, and Baek Chung ate his own food at the door. He arrived alone, which was already quite a statement of intent. A man who arrived at a place like this without a visible escort was either insignificant or had far exceeded the need to demonstrate his importance, to the point that the demonstration had become unnecessary. He was about 45 years old, as thin as someone who had maintained his physique through constant discipline rather than physical work, and with the characteristic stillness of a person accustomed to being the most observant presence in any room he entered. Her clothes were functional and expensive, in the sense that clothes were expensive when quality was chosen for durability rather than appearance. She wore nothing. He sat down at the table closest to the fireplace without being invited and stared at the kitchen for a long time before speaking. The procurement office received Oh Dae-sung's report 4 days ago, he said. He had already been here twice before today. Observing the operation from the outside, Kong Tao looked at him. I know. Suri described you after your second visit. Yoon Sang-cheol absorbed this without visible reaction. Your street observer. Yes. He looked again at the kitchen, the second home, the organized shelves, the storage area, the documents visible on the countertop. I wanted to form my own opinion before this conversation. So? And my opinion confirmed what the report said, which is that you've built something that shouldn't exist in the Makil district, and I still don't fully understand it. He looked directly at Kong Tao. I'd like to understand. Bak Rai appeared in the kitchen doorway with her tally sheet and stood upright with the composure of someone who had decided that her presence in that conversation was not optional. Kong Tao didn't tell him to leave. What exactly does the procurement office want to understand? Kong Tao asked. Yoon Sang-cheol spoke for 20 minutes without asking anything. He described the current state of the city's food supply with the impassive precision of a man who had been managing an increasingly serious problem long enough to have completely lost emotional distance from it. In the last 3 months, army purchasing operations had withdrawn 40% of the primary grain supply from the city's civilian market. The established food operations, the large establishments, the street kitchens, the district supply networks that men like Park Gwi-nam had built over decades, were structured for a supply environment that no longer existed. They were unable to adapt because their cost structures, staff expectations, customer relationships, and their very identity were built around the acquisition of quality ingredients. The city was experiencing supply shortages. Not a famine, not yet. There is a gap between what the population needs to continue functioning and what the current supply infrastructure can offer at affordable prices. He explained that the supply office had inspected all food establishments in the city's 12 districts to find those that maintained the quality and volume of service under the current supply conditions. They had found 4. Of those 4, 3 operated on a reservation system that would run out in 6 weeks. The 4th was this kitchen. He stopped talking and waited. Kong Tao said, "What does the procurement office want?" "The scale," Yoon Sang-cheol said. "Not your cooking. Your method. Implemented across 6 districts, utilizing procurement office resources and distribution infrastructure, with you as the operational architect." The offer was on the table. Bak Rai took note. Kong Tao looked at the hearth. At the second fire that Malsoon was preparing for the afternoon cycle. The documentation on the shelf consisted of 93 pages of operating procedures, written in sufficient detail that someone who had never seen the kitchen could reconstruct it from the notes. I had written it that way on purpose. I had always known this conversation would come, one way or another. The documentation was precisely the preparation for this moment, the moment when someone with resources and influence wanted to multiply what the kitchen had built and needed to understand if the method was transferable. The question was what transferable meant. Tell me, Kang Tao said, what would the procurement office control and what would I control? Yoon Sang-cheol had clearly prepared for this question. He described a structure that consisted of the provisioning of office resources, logistics, distribution infrastructure, official supply channels, combined with the operational methodology of the kitchen and the supervision of the implementation by Kang Tao. The procurement office would handle the scale. He would handle the method. And what about the district operations I've already established? Kang Tao asked. Absorbed by the structure. Under whose authority? A brief pause. The procurement office. Kang Tao looked at him. So the method becomes yours and the operation becomes yours, and I become an employee of the procurement office implementing a system that was built without you, under conditions that your office was not capable of creating. Yoon Sang-cheol said nothing. That's not a partnership, Kang Tao said. It's an acquisition. It's the only offer currently available. Then it's not the right offer. The room fell silent. Outside, the Makil district was going about its usual afternoon business, street vendors near the entrance, the coming and going of people that had become regular enough to form a neighborhood rhythm, the distant sound of the textile district 2 neighborhoods to the east, where Melsoon's cousin was getting ready for the afternoon's deliveries. Yoon Sang-cheol looked at Kang Tao with an expression that had not changed, but had become more pronounced, the expression of a man who had come expecting a negotiation about the terms and who, instead, found himself negotiating about something more fundamental. What would the right offer look like, he asked. The kitchen and everything it has built remains operationally independent, Kang Tao stated. It is not absorbed, acquired, or restructured under the authority of the procurement office. What the procurement office receives is a documented method, support for implementation, and the assurance that the network operating in these districts functions correctly and is stable. In return, the procurement office provides official registration protection, access to the supply chain at institutional prices, and confirmation that the kitchen's operations are not subject to the kind of district-level interference that has been applied for the past 6 weeks. Yoon Sang-cheol was silent for a moment. You want protection without subordination. I want the procurement office to understand that the value of this kitchen comes from its independence. The moment it becomes a procurement office operation, it becomes subject to the problems inherent in procurement offices, the same bureaucratic burden, the same vulnerabilities to corruption, the same institutional inertia that has produced the current gap that it is trying to fill. You don't need to own it. You need it to exist and function. Another silence. This one longer. Park Gwi-nam filed a formal complaint yesterday with the city's trade office, said Yoon Sang-cheol. It's not a district-level complaint. It's a municipal-level complaint. Alleging unlicensed multi-district distribution practices and unfair competition. The case will go to trial in 2 weeks. Kang Tao had been waiting for this information since Oh Dae-sun's visit. Park Gwi-nam had risen to the municipal level just as planned. Having exhausted his influence at the district level, he had climbed to the administrative channel with which the conversation now intersected in the procurement office. That complaint, Kang Tao said, disappears if the procurement office registers the distribution network as an officially recognized food safety operation. Yoon Sang-cheol looked at him. That's what it is, Kang Tao said. The record reflects reality. The complaint disappears because what they're complaining about is an authorized operation. Park Gwi-nam loses his crowbar. And the supply office gets a fully operational food safety net in 3 districts that costs them nothing to run and provides a buffer against the shortage you described. The offer was unlike anything Yoon Sang-cheol had come prepared to receive. Kang Tao could see how he recalculated, not the numbers, but the structure. The difference between an acquisition that gave control to the procurement office and an acknowledgement that gave credit to the procurement office for something that was already working. I have to get this back, Yoon Sang-cheol finally said. I know, Kang Tao said. Take the documentation. He pointed to the bound copy that Bakrai had prepared and placed on the table at some point during the conversation. He hadn't asked her to do it, she had simply understood that it was the right time. Everything the operation does is there. When you show it to whomever is necessary, they will understand that the method is real, that it works, and that it is well documented enough to be replicated. That's what you're bringing them. Not a promise. Evidence. Yoon Sang-cheol took the documents. He observed him, his weight, the thickness of 70 days of operational record. He stood up and looked at Kang Tae-oh one last time. You've been planning this conversation from the beginning. I've been planning a conversation like this, Kang Tae-oh said. The specific form will depend on what you bring. After she left, the kitchen was silent for a moment. Then Baek Chung, who was still at the door, said without turning around, the afternoon queue is forming. Bak Rai picked up his tally sheet. Malsoon relit the second fire. Kang Tae-oh took the ladle. The system indicator changed again, shifting from gold to something he had no prior reference for. A new panel briefly appeared, Arc 1 complete day 71. Portions served to date, 4340. Districts reached 3, Hunger Index, Mackel, 61 from 71 at the start. Establishment reputation, 79/100. Network nodes, 7, staff, 8 main, for support. Threats neutralized, 9, documentation, complete and distributed. Status, and no longer a tavern. Updated classification, district food anchor expansion threshold. The procurement office will resume operations. Park GWI Nam will resume its expansion. The army's supply chain will tighten even further. The city's hunger index is 68 and still rising. You started with the worst kitchen in the worst district. Now you're the person the city's food office came looking for. The second arc begins when Yoon Sang-cheol returns. Prepare accordingly. Kang Tae-oh read it, made a note of it, and set it aside. The first customer of the afternoon service walked through the door, a regular dockworker who greeted Baek Chung with the familiarity and ease of a man arriving at a place that is part of his daily routine. Kang Tae-oh filled a bowl. The city would bring its problems when it brought them. The procurement office would return with a revised offer, a stricter stance, or something completely different that he hadn't yet anticipated. Whatever it was, he would read it from here, from the kitchen that was still the kitchen, still the foundation, still what Tuniang in 71 days and a system built of bones and melted fat and a boy who listened at doorways had turned into something a city official had scoured a slum to find. He hadn't won. He had reached the edge of the first game and could see the second beginning on the other side. He poured the next bowl.